Welcome to Building My Legacy podcast. This podcast is designed for leaders and entrepreneurs who want to leave a legacy and will provide strategies that focus upon key elements for legacy creation, determining your desired impact and its benefit, increasing your legacy's reach by engaging key stakeholders, planning, prioritizing, and executing. Here's your host, Dr. Lois Sonstegard.
Welcome, everybody, to today's Building My Legacy podcast. I have with me today Dr. Justin Hiebert. He is a SHRM certified trainer and developer for organizations and has a unique niche in that he coaches small business owners, entrepreneurs, and world changers. So there you go, people who are going to make a difference in this world. And people who are really looking to get things done right. He frees up his clients' schedules, which enables them to leave a legacy of influence and impact. So looking at clear and measurable goals, plan for strategic growth, and eliminate overwhelm. So those are huge issues for today. So Justin, tell me, how did you get into this field?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I suppose that the easiest place to start, right, is always that I have found these sorts of stories are birthed out of our own journey, right? And so I got started coaching because I had a coach, and I was in the midst of my doctoral program. And
your doctoral program is organizational psychology, or?
I have a doctorate of ministry and missional leadership. And so looking at, I'll share that in the story. But what I ended up doing was I was working in a church at the time and facing some leadership health and burnout issues. And you could look back at the history of the church and realize that leaders were leaving because of burnout. And I kind of said, well, number one, I don't know. I don't want to do that. And number two, I don't know how to stop that. And so in talks with my own coach, started to frame my doctoral program about what does it mean to create healthy leaders. And I was lamenting with him once and said, man, I wish just somebody would do something about this issue of burnout. And he goes, you can do something about that. And I was like, I can. And so from there, it was just like, it was this awakening of, I talk about this issue of world changers. There were many times I'd, talk to my wife like, man, I'd feel like I could lead people better if I could just get out of my own way sometimes, right? And so my journey with coaching really started there, that sometimes we're so unaware of our own biases or bad habits or blind spots that we kind of feel like, man, I feel called to do something. I'm just not quite sure what that looks like. And for me, it was very important to have that coach come alongside me in that moment. And that was the first time where I was like, man, that's what I want to help provide for other people. That if we can raise that level of awareness and that level of leadership health, then we can truly go on to make a difference in our communities. And from there, it's become niching down to business owners and saying, the way the local economy runs off of small business and the way those people care about their communities, I wanted to come alongside and help them do great things wherever they happen to be located.
Okay. So before we go into that, I just want to go back for a moment to burnout, because some of the original research that Charles Garfield and some of the other people did many, many years ago showed that burnout occurred when people lost their sense of purpose in what they were doing. So speak to me a little bit about burnout.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And some of my own research seems to indicate that leaders fall victim to burnout because of this sort of perpetual crisis mode that they can get caught up into. And the problem arises when we as leaders can convince ourselves, well, I only thrive in crisis. And so really what I tried to do is step back from that and say, crises are going to happen in any given organization, but that doesn't mean the leader has to become dictated by other people's emotional responses. And so I spent a lot of my time and a lot of my practice on burnout, looking and saying, what are the key foundations to remaining healthy? And so I identified 7 practices that good leaders do. And the foundation for that was what I call the calling, right? You have to be clear on the reason you're here. So a lot of times the language we use is you need to be able to answer the question, why on earth am I on earth? And if you don't have a good gripping story to that, you're always going to struggle. And then from there, we look at some internal dynamics of health. What does it mean to be mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually healthy? However you want to define that. And then we look at some of those external components. What does it mean to be relationally and financially healthy as well? And when you kind of put all of that together, you get what I call this abundant generosity as a leader, right? My own house is in order, my own internal metrics. I'm emotionally aware. I'm physically healthy. I'm eating good food. I have physical energy. My relationships with those around me are strong. My finances are in order. And now I can abundantly give back to those around me or the causes that I care most about. But it starts, that foundation is that clear calling of what am I trying to accomplish while I'm here?
So you work largely with businesses, small businesses. Do you work with churches as well, given your background?
I used to a lot more than I do now. It's not that I'm against that. That's the changing nature of business. And that's honestly part of my own business model. So when I was a pastor, it may sound weird, but I spent a decade as a pastor, and the biggest guilt that I carried with me was that I was taking a paycheck from an organization that I loved. Like I wanted to be able to give to the church the gifts that I felt like I had without any sort of financial compensation necessary as a pastor. And so I have instead tried to work with business owners and say, what are these characteristics that you need to be healthy? And that has just freed me up to look at churches and other nonprofit organizations and say, these are people also on the front line doing much different work. How can we bless their leaders? And so a lot of times I end up creating, rather than formal business relationships, just working partnerships with food banks or homeless shelters or whatever, and saying, here are the things that the business community has that can offer you, and here are the things that you're either in need of, but also the things that you can offer, and trying to work outside of that system to just create partnerships for the larger community.
So what's your sense, especially right now with what businesses have been faced with the economic uncertainty that has surrounded us with COVID? We're not sure if we're coming out of it yet or how much longer it will last. So what's the elasticity of small business in particular to be able to address those needs? What are you finding?
Yeah, so my clientele prior to this, kind of as all of this was starting, February, March, April, fell into two predominant categories. And as I've continued to talk and network and reach out to others, this is mostly held up as true. So I don't want to say it's the rule, but here's the general trend I'm seeing. You were either labeled essential and experienced a huge uptick in growth, or you were labeled non-essential and had long-term questions of, are we even going to be able to survive this? And so I lost multiple clients who said, hey, I can't keep my doors open. I can't afford to continue to work with you. Circle back with me in, what we thought would be 3 weeks and then became 3 months. And now we're still kind of, they're gun shy about coming back on. At the same time, I've had other clients that started with 2 employees and within the span of a month had to hire 8 more because they had so much business that they did not plan on that level of expected growth. And so while I think that kind of drastic nature has leveled off, there's still a sense of people are now wondering what's next, right? And so some new reports have come out. I saw one last week that said people are starting to quit their jobs, which is a tentatively good sign of an economy because they feel like options are out there. And then the very next day, I saw another article that said 60% of the small businesses that have closed aren't planning on reopening. So I kind of think in large part, many of us are making this up as we go, right? Like we just don't have a good sense of what is the federal government going to do that affects me, and what's the state or local government going to do, and what's my own level of responsibility and how I can navigate this. And so people are cautiously optimistic, I think, is the general tone that I'm getting. But this is also just ingrained, I think, a cultural sense of fear that I don't want to get too excited because things may change on me again.
So as you work with companies that are struggling with that level of uncertainty, I mean, it reminds me in a way of working with somebody who's just had a diagnosis of stage 4B cancer. So already metastasized spread to other organs, and you're looking at, is there a future? Isn't there a future? So how do you coach people through that uncertainty?
Yeah. So there's a certain level of optimism that I think has to just be ingrained. And so a lot of the early work that I do early on with clients is about making sure we're actually just thinking the right way. I think it was John Maxwell, one of his books said, thinking is such hard work, and that's why so few people do it. Like good thinking process, the way we actually think about thinking is extraordinarily hard to do. And so sometimes we just have these, oh man, my business has suffered, it's always going to suffer kind of mentalities. And having somebody like my coach did for me come alongside and say, we can actually do something about that. Maybe the first spark of life that they've heard that things can get better. And so one of the places that we always start is just, where are you at now? And where is it that you want to go? And so I talk a lot with my clients about we start with the end in mind, and then we can just reverse engineer the process. But we have to get clear on what it is that we're working on. So we create, in addition to corporate values or mission statements, we create these value propositions of what's the type of business I'm going to run, but that comes down to what's the type of person I'm going to be. And that's where it allows us to say, no wonder your employees are struggling with coming into work. You're a pretty negative person, and they look to you for leadership. So we start a lot with, what does it mean to get your mind right, to approach the world with a certain worldview of hope and optimism? Yes, things are bad, but I'm a firm believer that we have much more power and control over that outcome and over our own thought process in that than maybe sometimes we give ourselves credit for.
So as you work with companies and bring them through this, are you also measuring results so you know the impact of what you're doing, or how do you go back and review? Does it make a difference?
It absolutely does. That if we don't know what we're measuring, we're okay with any results, and we don't want to be okay with just any results. We want specific results. And so we do this through a twofold process. And part of that is the client's responsibility, right? As the business owner, as the leader, as the entrepreneur, is my product selling? Am I engaging a larger portion of the market, right? And there's some of those business pieces that I would say my role in that is to give them some general oversight, but I allow them to build that team. I'm one part of their team. They also need to have, maybe somebody that does marketing or that helps with social media engagement. I don't give insight into all of that. So I work alongside them and say, are those metrics continuing to come at it? Or if not, is there ambiguity on your part that you're not presenting this picture well? So that's the business side of it. But then personally, you can hear in a client's voice when I call them and they're like, and I say, hey, how are you doing this week? Oh, I'm just continuing to work. Like, there's energy that happens even over the phone. And so some of those metrics that we track are, what's your morning routine like? Are you waking up consistently, right? It's those internal metrics of health. Are you exercising? Are you spending time in relationship with people? That you don't want to build this great, successful business and then come home and be a jerk to your kids or be, an absent father. And your kids are like, man, I had lots of money growing up, but I wish I'd rather known my dad. For the people that I work with, for the leaders that I come alongside, we work hand in hand to make sure both of those happen. And when we work, we are fully present at work. And when we're at home or giving our hobbies or invested in friendships, we set parameters in place to make sure we're invested there so that they can be ultimately the person they've been called to become.
So when you work with people and organizations, the biggest challenges they face are what today?
That's a great question. The biggest challenges I see my clients face are, number one, the burden of responsibility they feel for their employees. And I've got clients, I've got other HR partners that I work with on some projects. And one of the things that we can be careful with if we're not, one of the things we can fall victim to if we're not careful is they say, well, are we going to make a decision based on the employer or based on the employee? And I just think we can do both, right? It's not an either or proposition that one party has to win. And so they care for their employees and they want to know how to do that well. At the same time, they want to make sure that their extended family community is taken care of. So how can I lead this business well, which extends to employees? And how can I take care of my family? How can I take care of my community? Was talking with one business owner this week who one of his biggest laments was the amount of charitable giving that he can't do this year because his business has been so affected. And so walking alongside them, like, as things recover, let's build in this plan to get back to where we want to be. We can acknowledge that pain. We can acknowledge that hurt. That doesn't mean we have to stay there. Doesn't mean it'll always be this way. We can move forward.
So part of people's sense of purpose comes from being able to do those things in the community that they feel are important. So when you have to let go of that for a period of time, where do people find that purpose for what they do so they don't burn out while they are waiting for the pieces to come together?
Yeah, one of the core components we talk about is structure and routine, right? And I hinted at that maybe earlier, that when we're at work, and when we're not, we're not. But we make some very clear, definitive boundaries on those. And so it's not just because the great downside is this little phone that I can carry with me is both a personal device and a work device. Right. And it's great at both, but if I'm not sure what I'm using it for, it ends up becoming a trap, right? And so we set very clear boundaries. And it might sound weird, but I sit down with my clients like, when are we going to check email and text messages? And we plan it into our calendar. And if it's not during that time, then you're not allowed to do it, right? If it is at the dinner table with your kids telling you how your day is, that text message can wait. It might be urgent and it might need to wait 5 minutes, or maybe it's not that important and it can wait till tomorrow morning. But we set very clear parameters because we take what I call is this total life inventory of what are the key metrics that matter to you. And if you're not fully awake and fully alive and fully energized by all of these areas that we look at, then we start to create a plan to help us get there, because we want to be intentional about everything we do and instill good habits that not only model to ourselves, but those around us what's ultimately important.
You know, it's very similar to Walter Trobisch. Are you familiar with him?
Mm-mm.
He was a great psychoanalyst out of Switzerland, but he did a lot of work with people in the church, particular people on the mission field who were burning out. It was at the turn of the century. And one of his big concepts was you have to know when to shut the door. So, you know, even back then, people were struggling through, how do I prioritize my own family and my own needs? And I think that is the problem when you are very focused on making a difference in the community and leaving a legacy, right?
Right. It is. And the problem is we can become convinced of a false sense of legacy. If I were to ask my average business owner without any sort of baiting, what matters to you? Most of them, I think, would say, oh man, having a strong business, I'd like to grow. I had one client, we just finished the session. He's like, I want to grow 25% by the end of the year. That's a pretty lofty goal. I mean, kudos to him for setting a big goal. We'll work on it. But we also have to back up and say that absolutely matters. And I don't want to discourage that. You've got a wife, you've got kids, you've got friends, you've got hobbies, right? And so the problem is if we fall for this false sense of legacy, and we can convince ourselves, and I call myself guilty here, when things get bad, my default is to work. And I almost have to force myself to go and enjoy some hobbies, right? And so I have intentionally over the last 3 to 6 months, not just trying to have hobbies, but I've actually started to document the process and the experience, because I have to remind myself, you can only work 24 hours a day for so long before you're just good to nobody, right? And so what does it mean to leave the phone in the car and take my daughter somewhere? What does it mean to cook a meal for my family, or just go ride my motorcycle, even though I, may not think I have time for it? Right. Because ultimately that larger scope of legacy needs to outlive me. If the business dies when I die, that's not a legacy. It needs to be something that continues to give on and pass on from generation to generation, not just within my family, but within the community.
Part of what I'm also hearing you say, Justin, is part of what you're doing with your companies is you're helping them build relationships, alliances, so to speak, with people in the community. How are you going about doing that?
So there are a couple of ways. The easiest one for me to talk about up front is I very intentionally a couple of years ago built into the coaching practice this idea of giving back and generosity. And so clients typically work with me in 12-week blocks that we book a segment of 12 weeks together. You buy a package, and whether that means we're just doing phone coaching or there's some in-person team training, right? There's some scope to this.
Right.
But one of the options that you have is what we call this legacy give back. And that is just a scholarship fund where if a larger, let's say maybe not necessarily small business, a medium-sized business brings me in, they can set aside a certain portion of their money to go to a scholarship fund for either some of their employees that couldn't afford coaching, or they could just say throw it into the general pot, and that gives me the freedom to find an entrepreneur who needs coaching and maybe can't afford it and say, don't worry, this scholarship fund has taken care of it, right? And so my business model allows me to have some of that freedom and flexibility, and that's not income. I don't touch that. That sits here until somebody needs it. The other thing that I do is these needs assessment is really just, it's practicing the coaching skill of listening, right? I spend a lot of time every week networking, and I become very good at listening for maybe that need that they don't know what they're saying, right? And that's part of what that coaching relationship. One of the things that I say is that I'm going to tell you what you're saying without you realizing you're saying it, because we can get so stuck in our own head that we don't understand maybe what we're feeling inside. And so my job as coach is maybe just to point that out. That happens in networking as well, right? Well, what I really need is a sale. Maybe what you don't need is a sale. What you need is a contact. What you need is a referral. What you need is somebody else who has been there before. What you really need is not a sale, but a mentor, right? And so then I look at what are the business contacts that I have, and who are the people that I know that I could connect. And the best feeling that I can get from that is when I say, person A, here's person B, you guys need to network. I'll set up a lunch and then excuse myself. And the amount of friendships and partnerships that I have seen come from that I don't get financial contribution for means much more to me, because I see this continuing role of generosity gain some momentum and spread out to new contacts and new businesses, and in some cases, new business ventures for people partnering together.
So part of what I'm hearing you say is you create those collaborative partnerships or networks, and without necessarily being a part of them yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so what you're also saying is that there's enough business that is generated from doing that you don't need to worry about the income you will not be acquiring. Is that correct?
Yes. And again, that is part of my belief that as I was getting into coaching, and especially money is a very funny subject in the church. And growing up in the church and being educated to work in a church and trying to pastor a church, that's a difficult conversation. And if I talk about it once a year, people want to know why I always harp on the subject of money, right? And so I as I started this transition from out of the church world and into this coaching world, just said, I think part of my own thinking that needs to change is this relation to money. And the greatest disservice we do to ourselves in the world is when we think, there's one pie and I have to get as much of it as I can. And that means that I'm quite willing to take from you, because if I have more than you have less, then I win. I firmly believe there's enough of that for everybody. I've done the metrics on what I need to do to consider myself not just full-time as a coach, but like full client capacity. There's way more people in this world than I'm able to take on. And so the more good that I can do, there's enough business, there's enough finance, there's enough goodwill, there's enough generosity of all of that out there that I don't need to practice hoarding and selfishness. And more that I can freely give of that stuff, that matters to me much more than, oh man, I probably could have made a little bit more money if I'd have been stingy. There's enough out there of all of that for everybody.
So Justin, as you work with people, we've talked a little bit about where their biggest challenges are. Where do you see their biggest opportunities?
Yeah, the biggest opportunities for everybody is part of why I have the tagline that I do, and that is that I empower leaders to get the right things done. The biggest opportunity for anybody is by focusing on the right things. And as a small business owner, you start this dream, right? And you work hard in the evening hours, and you sacrifice and you sweat in ways that people may never see or acknowledge or recognize. And don't you know that business starts to grow, and then you need to hire a second employee and maybe a third one. And all of a sudden you realize I'm still doing everything, even though I have two other people hired. And that's where I come in and say, no, now you need to get the right things done. There are things that you as the business owner, only you can do. And I will help you focus on those things. And the reason you hire employees is so that you can stop doing it all. I've got one client who's like, why am I still so busy? Because you've hired 5 people this year and are still trying to run everything yourself. He's gone from 1 to 6 employees. No wonder he's so stressed. Hey, let's start to lessen your load. You've hired this person, trust them to do their job. And so that biggest opportunity for anybody is to say, what are really the most important things that I can do? Maybe they don't make the most money, but they're only the things that I can do, and I will trust that team around me to do the rest of these tasks. And the more specific that you can get as the business owner, as the leader, as the world changer on those things, the more good you're going to do in the world.
It is true. The more we hear what it is that is needed and that we can do, that we can control, the more we have that sense of, yep, I can make this work, don't we?
Yep.
But it's hard to come to that. And I think one of the things that I hear is people saying yes, and it would be great, wouldn't it, if I could do those things, but I don't have the tools to do it, or it makes me uncomfortable because I'm so uncertain about the future. And the reality is none of us can make the future certain. It is more uncertain now than it's ever been. And yet there's that heart desire to hear those words, isn't there?
There is, and that's hard. And generally, I tell business owners one of a couple of things in those scenarios. The first is just that we can never be 100% certain, but keep in mind that you've literally made it through 100% of what life has thrown at you so far. If you are still alive, if you're still breathing, if you still have a heartbeat, you are undefeated in this thing called life. So don't discredit your own ability to adapt and overcome whatever scary giant monster you want to think is in the future. So that's maybe the first reminder. Then the second is, if you have that team around you and you're still scared and are unafraid to let go, then you've either got some insecurities we need to talk about, which is okay because we all have them as leaders, or you don't trust your team. And that one really needs to be addressed, because the hiring was bad. Maybe you need to let somebody go, or maybe you need to hire somebody else, and that makes finances even tighter. But if you have hired and put in place a team and you are still scared to let go, that's an indicator of potential, not just slowing or capping of business, but of potential failure that really needs to be addressed. You should be able to trust those around you to carry that dream with you and alongside you and help you go farther than you could go by yourself.
Hiring the right people is always a trick. So what are your suggestions for people who are looking to hire and expand their business?
Yeah. Relax for a second and don't feel the absolute pressure to get it right all the time. Is maybe a bit counterintuitive, but that's where we start, because I'm, again, such a firm believer that with the right team, we can get farther. And so maybe I just dealt with this a couple of weeks ago. We hired somebody for one position and then found they're great, just not in that role, right? And so if we can lower the stress on this has to be the right hire right now, and instead say, and this person is great, they can be a valuable asset to our team, and we think they're going to fit really well here, but also give yourself the freedom to just say what matters is the difference we're trying to make in the world. And so if you are hiring based on some of those values, right? How do you like to spend your free time? Where do you like to give back? What are the causes that you're passionate about. Those speak to me almost just as much as the skills that you have, because I'm a firm believer I can teach skills, right? In any scenario. I could teach you to type faster, or I can teach you to have better customer service. Sometimes what I can't change is the heart that you're going to bring into the job and the passion that you have. And so hiring for those sorts of things, the people that are passionate, just like you are, about leaving that legacy, can overcome any of those other skills-based issues that might arise.
Justin, our time is almost up. So last thoughts that you have that you would like to share with the audience, do you think that they need to hear? What is it that if they understood or felt more deeply, they would be more successful?
Yeah. Leadership is predominantly, to me, about two issues. We could say it's about 1,000, but the two that I want to hammer home is, first of all, it's about the courage, the courage to act, the courage to show compassion, the courage to show vulnerability. It's also about community. That if I have the courage to bring people around me, and I actually have those people who believe in that same message with me, those are the people that end up becoming world changers. And too often we can get stuck in our own negativity, in our own mindset, in our own false beliefs, that we fail to act with courage. And sometimes we put the pressure on ourselves that we have to do it by ourselves. And neither of those is true. Don't listen to the false voices, but practice courage to take action, and have those people around you that support you and are urging you, begging you to get better, and walk that journey with them. Wow, that's great advice. I think courage at any level is so important, and we don't talk enough about it. I think we talk about what limits us. We don't talk about what makes us courageous enough. So I appreciate that perspective. So Justin, thank you so much for being with us on this podcast. For those of you who are listening, we will have information about Justin in our show notes, so you can get in contact with him. And if you need some assistance, just let us know. We'll be glad to connect you with Justin. And also, if you please visit our website, www.buildtomorrow.com, and our social media at Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube at buildtomorrow.com. So thank you all for listening to Building My Legacy podcast today. And Justin, thank you so much. Thank you.
You've been listening to Building My Legacy podcast with Dr. Lois Sonstegard. To book your appointment with Dr. Sonstegard, visit www.buildtomorrow.com.